Now, in this gaming community, I have seen a very real and common misconception among gamers, that franchises such as Pokémon, Five Nights at Freddy's, Sonic, and similar franchises have some deep lore and backstory to them. The problem is, that is not only simply not the case, but fanboys making up theories about their video games does not fill in any plot holes whatsoever, and it also can cover up for bad writing too, as people will then try to throw around unconfirmed theories as if it's official backstory when it's not. Now, while most of this video is going to talk about Pokemon, I'll also talk about some other franchises that do the same thing as well. Now, Pokemon is a role-playing game series, which puts it in the same genre as games developed by companies such as Square Enix, BioWare, Bethesda, CD Projekt Red, Atlas, and other developers known for making these role-playing games. Now, while earlier role-playing games didn't have very deep storylines, being influenced by pen and paper games, and in fact there have been various games based off them, from Shadowrun to MechWarrior to Planescape Torment and Baldur's Gate, by the end of the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo era, they had been known for deep storylines, with some games even offering decision systems and character customization with stats, and CD-based systems such as the Sega CD, Turbo CD, computers, and the PlayStation, giving way to sprawling 4-disc games with full-motion video cutscenes, voice acting, and storylines being the front and center main focus of the game. Now, during this time, like about the same time as the PS1, Pokemon came out for the Game Boy. Actually, in 1996 to be exact, the same year as Diablo, Daggerfall, Quake, Duke Nukem 3D, and various other games too. It eventually ended up selling through the roof, becoming the best-selling role-playing game of all time, and for several years the franchise itself gained wide appeal for a few years, propelling the original series of Pokemon to iconic status, with sequels selling pretty similar numbers too. And I mean Gold and Silver sold real close to Red, Blue, and Green. Despite the Game Boy Advance being a sales success though, Generation 3, or Ruby and Sapphire, sold a lot less than Red, Blue, and Green did, or even Gold and Silver. And the franchise also lost some of its appeal too as people moved on. And while Diamond and Pearl still sold more than Generation 3 did, it still did not reach Generations 1 and 2, and each successive generation has sold less and less, despite X and Y being billed as the fastest selling Pokemon game ever. I mean, even Black and White has sold more, and that says something about a series that at one point was selling through the roof, had itself embedded in pulp culture, was popular at every grade level, but it seems like now the audience is thinning out and fewer people even care about the newer games. Now, what could possibly be causing this? Well, aside from several obvious reasons, such as most of the new character designs being flat out garbage, another reason is the fact that the game has tried too hard to focus on storylines and fail at it. Now, despite the fact that Pokemon has barely had any storyline in the games, and despite the fact that you're probably going to get very little storyline out of it either way because of this, and plus Pokemon has followed the same storyline template since Generation 1, or if you want to be more descriptive, Generation 3, the games have been getting more and more linear, pretty much forcing you to do what the game wants you to as the game shoves the storyline down your throat like it's some sort of pretentious storyline. And it really does come off as pretentious because the game is the same exact storyline as Generation 3. It's the same thing each generation, where you've got evil team wants to find Pokemon so they can do evil things and follow their agenda and actually get it done. I mean, because that's the storyline every single generation. It's the same exact thing each and every time. It's been that way with Gen 3, 4, 5, and 6. Even Generations 1 and 2, the generations that happening to like in 2014, will result in some Pokemon fan calling you a Gen 1er while attacking you with meme pictures straight out of Know Your Meme, have at least a storyline that's connected. complete with Kanto from Generation 1 several years later in Generation 2, and Generation 3 having the GameCube games with their own storyline being connected with each other, and the Hoenn connection where they try to tie Hoenn into Fire Red and Leaf Green with you actually linking up with Hoenn, and of course the remakes having some more connections too. Sure, it was simple, but at least you weren't hurting from all the edge. I'm going to start at Generation 4 though, because that's where the origins of this whole pretentiousness began. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl have had bits of pieces of lore scattered throughout the region called the Sinnoh-myths, complete with a bulb article on it. Most of these are vague bits and pieces of the past of the region, hinting at what was going to be forced in the next 2 generations, stuff you'd probably forget afterwards. However, one little bit that hinted at the shitty direction the series was going, while it would pander to the new Pokemon fanbase, was Sinnoh Folk Story 3, which in the Japanese version, which was changed for the English version as you'll see why, went like this. There once were Pokemon that married people. There once were people who married Pokemon. This was a normal thing because long ago, people on Pokemon were the same. Now, anyone who has hung around the Pokemon fanbase for a while knows that this confirms one thing. The Pokemon waifu fantasies many people have are in fact canon along with their Human X Pokemon fantasies that people write explicit fanfiction about. And it also doesn't help that the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, despite being better written than the main series, though still not having too much in the way of plot with some bare details, never explained a lot of things. A lot of potential was wasted on, oh golly, my rescue team is so cool dudes, with the backstory being very bare and vague since we all know that anyone who has browsed a website about fan fiction, or let's just say a website where people have roleplay characters, know that writing a backstory that isn't crap takes some skill. And it also didn't help that the main Generation 4 games were a straight-up rehash of Generation 3 story-wise. Evil Team wants X Pokemon to achieve X goal, with no connections to previous generations whatsoever. Except maybe a little in Heart Gold Soul Silver, that like nobody would notice. Then Generations 5 and 6 felt like DeviantArt took over, with bad writing everywhere, quick excuses such as Generation 6 talking about both multiple universes and the whole 3,000 years ago event, Team Plasma from Generation 5 and that weird Kid N, and of course glossing over what could have been potential to expand and go in depth to make the Evil Team be the same exact stuff as last time. There's little to no connections with past games, besides having the same Generation 3 storyline yet again. There's also no real lore, as you'll hear some quick thing about Mega Evolution and some more, but then you'll never find anything specific, and no, TV tropes doesn't count. Especially when there are other games in the same genre that go in depth on even events that happened thousands of years ago. Pokemon just pales in comparison. I mean, especially when you have games such as the Dead Space series or BioShock where you pick up logs that explain what happened years ago, or Mass Effect where dialogue and your Galactic Codex tells you a lot too about the lore of the universe. And to make matters worse for Pokemon, each form of media takes place in an entirely different universe. Games have their own, spin-offs of the game have their own, manga, the anime, etc. Each one has its own storyline and universe, with differences in the roles of humans and Pokemon, with some involving Pokemon having full sentience, one many fans seem to prefer, and others having them as little more than animals that communicate like R2-D2 from Star Wars by famously saying nothing but their own name. Or how horror has few Pokemon being captured with Pokeballs being sold in the black market under the counter early in Coliseum, how the Ranger games featured you using your stylus to temporarily capture Pokemon, and how the Mystery Dungeon series had you recruiting Pokemon since you were a Pokemon since everyone is a Pokemon after all. And I'm not even getting into other stuff like how many versions of Red there are, and about the whole anime, and about how many mangas there are. I'm just glossing over this. In other words, there's little to no continuity, And usually in each universe, besides the very basics of the setting, there is very little going in depth, especially when compared to a game like Mass Effect, which has detail on even minor planets and the whole galactic codex, or even something like Digimon Tamers, which went in depth on the origins of the setting, both in the series itself and in official supplemental material. Pokémon, on the other hand, has had bits and pieces at most before the whole forced storyline stuff happened in recent generations, with recent generations forcing down a half-baked storyline that doesn't explain much at all, especially considering how many game theory styles and websites exist. Much of it leaves the player and fanbase to guess, making up theories for a kid's game with little in the way of story, which doesn't compensate for the fact that the story is badly written. And even stuff such as some of the mangas like Pokemon Adventures. Not only is it totally unrelated universe-wise to the other Pokemon media, but nobody's read many of the Pokemon mangas. I still remember the Pokemon fans I was with, none of them had read a manga whatsoever with Pokemon. Or basically just the only best of Pokemon collections that they had at one point before they re-released Pokemon Adventures, even though you could have found it on Google. But back to what I was saying, the same can apply to other game franchises too. One good, relevant at the time now, that is, example is Five Nights at Freddy's. It's literally as basic as it gets. A generic indie horror game where the whole point is to avoid the jump scare. Remember Slender? Except this time it's from Chuck E. Cheese influenced animatronics at a shady rundown pizza place which somehow has robots that can roam the premises at night. There's literally no storyline whatsoever, besides a few bits and pieces saying that you have a crappy job, years ago some robot bit off someone's brain off, and apparently some other creepy stuff that's edgy or something. And if you think it over deeper, it makes no sense whatsoever, since such a place would have already been shut down by the government, or basically sued out of business if this was reality. But let's be honest here, we're thinking this too much, but then again, so are the people who write theories about this game anyway. And apparently your main character also doesn't have the brains to quit, just like your average stupid horror movie or creepypasta protagonist. And yet tons of nerds online have come up with theories that get passed around as if it's official to compensate for the non-existent writing, and the sequel takes it even further. I mean, besides being a lazy cash-in complete with a 4:3 aspect ratio while the original was rendered in 16:9, and generic character designs that try to pander to the for Affinity audience, and keep in mind, For Affinity's admin gave them free ad space on his site known for drawing porn of the characters. And it has a story that makes less sense too. Does it take place in the future or the past? You can't tell, especially since it takes place in 1987, supposedly before the first one, and as usual, people come up with crackpot theories about this simple game, which, like I said, doesn't excuse the poor writing or the fact that it's basically a mobile phone game at best. But I could go on all day if I named all the franchises that have poor or non-existent continuity that people pretend exists, like Sonic for example, so I'll just end it here with this fact. Just because a series has tons of people making theories online doesn't mean that the story is good, or that the series has deep lore. In fact, it's just a sign of poor writing, and to make matters worse, it can encourage game developers to cut back on the story. After all, what's the point of trying to write a story or hiring someone to do it for you when you can write a poor story with plot holes and your fanbase will fill it in? It's a very bad mentality and one any gamer should be afraid of, and Pokemon is an example of this, and a pretty good one of what happens when it gets out of control. Despite some people saying, who plays it for the story? I mean, even though people ask that question, you have to keep in mind this is the same genre that has spawned games such as Mass Effect, and other games with deep storylines such as Planescape Torment. And not only does it not excuse the poor storyline, but it shows that Pokemon, even though it's in a genre where storyline is big, shows that people are willing to excuse it just because it has a brand name on it, even though the game tries to force it like it's got a good storyline. That's all I have to say.